Hi, Juno News. Alexander Brown here, back for another episode of Not Sorry. I'm the director of the National Citizens Coalition. I'm a host here. I'm a communicator, campaigner, columnist. Thrilled to have you here. And while you are here, junonews.com/not sorry for 20% off. We're grateful for your support. Budget 2025. The fallout continues. The questions continue. And Canadians, anything but ordinary and expert alike, they have questions. Pierre Poilievre has concerns about the numbers, as you know, it's both his job and opposition to have those concerns, but because that's an unprecedented non-pandemic amount of deficit. Take a look.
The cost of this Liberal budget will drive up the cost of food, housing, and everything else that Canadians buy. And the Prime Minister has broken every single promise he made just 7 short months ago. He promised a $62 billion deficit. He delivered nearly an $80 billion deficit, $16 billion bigger than he promised and twice the size that his predecessor left behind. He promised to lower the debt to GDP ratio. He raised it, and inflation along with it. He promised to spend less. He's spending $90 billion more, costing $5,400 per family in Canada. And that $90 billion, to the Prime Minister's heckles, is above and beyond the promised $16 billion that he says he will one day find. And if he doesn't find them, it will be over $100 billion in brand new spending to respond to the Prime Minister's heckles, Mr. Speaker. He also promised that he would invest more. His own budget document lays out a graph showing that every quarter of this year will see private sector business investment collapse. This costly budget forces Canadians to spend more on debt interest than on healthcare transfers. More than the government collects in GST. That means every dollar Canadians pay in GST will go to bankers and bondholders instead of to doctors and nurses. All while he raises the industrial carbon tax on farm equipment and fertilizer, and therefore food, on steel, concrete, and other industrial projects needed to build homes, a big tax increases on homes and food.
Now, it's not just the Conservatives who are worried about what's been presented here. Generationally, again, those sacrifices the Liberals want you to make, they only seem to fall on young and working Canadians, on Canada's missing to non-existent middle class. Liberal housing expert and advisor Mike Moffatt called this budget a disaster for housing. It doesn't address sky-high development costs or red tape, and only seeks to unlock these kinds of Carney Khrushchevkas, these public housing units and forever rentals that are a band-aid for this Liberal-inflicted housing crisis that they continue to exacerbate with record-high immigration levels that are only getting slightly better for now. And we're already seeing today the Century Initiative, our not so beloved mass immigration lobby with large corporate interests and ties to media. They're back in the papers today, back in the Globe, arguing for more infinite replacement, wage suppressing cogs in our economy that are often treated abhorrently and preyed upon, that then lead to record youth unemployment for your kids and grandkids. These limousine Liberal priorities still don't appear to have changed. They promised a transformative budget, and this appears to be everything but. There are some positive signs, such as a allusion to creating more grounds for economic growth, but the government remains the central planner, which is a big concern. Military, encouraging, believe it when we see it. But after saddling Canada's kids and grandkids with a historic millstone, with cosmetic changes, familiar to these Trudeau failures, they even reveled in that success at a party hosted by a consulting firm and a media company. Take a look at these images. That media organization, of course, has received Canadian government funding in the past. It's a big club and you ain't in it. It's a big budget that appears to exacerbate so many of the problems of the last few years. Professor Ian Lee joins us. He's an associate professor at Carleton University, terrific economist, has done amazing work. You can read many of his missives in the Financial Post or at the Hub. He helps us unpack this. He provides a great perspective here. Join us. Ian Lee joins us, associate professor at Sprott School of Business at Carleton. Ian, thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Now, we're coming out of the budget. The government's spinning it one way, even celebrating it, the federal Liberals. But in the past, you've described Canada's economic problems as structural, not cyclical.
That's right.
Does this Liberal budget do anything to address that structural issue?
A bit, and let me explain that.
Okay.
If we use as our benchmark, our comparator, to use elegant academic language, to this Carney budget, and we say, okay, let's compare it to the 10 Trudeau budget. I think there were 10 budgets under Trudeau. Well, this is definitely a break from the Trudeau years, and that's a very good thing.
Yeah.
Trudeau focused in 10 years, and I'm giving a solid empirical justification. He was focused overwhelmingly on redistributing the pie. He was focused on consumption, to use the economic sense of consumption, that is to say pharmacare and daycare and various social programs, and then redistributing it. It was not about growing the pie, making the pie bigger so that the standard of living would increase and people would have more money, would make more money. So in that sense, I gave Mr. Carney for the budget kudos for reversing the disastrous decisions of the past 10 years that caused so much damage to the economy and the standard of living, measured by, for example, the productivity declining precipitously in Canada and other key metrics that were going down. So he's changed direction. And this is much more an investment budget. I can't remember how many times the word was mentioned in the budget.
Hundreds of times.
Hundreds.
Yeah.
And so he's going in the right direction. But before, that's faint praise, because I don't think he went far enough.
Yeah.
And in some instances, he went too far. My criticism of the Liberal years has been very much that they put government at the center of. It's a top-down philosophy, and it's very similar to Europe too. By the way, it's the same criticism I have of Europe.
Yeah.
That they believe that that government should be the driving force and the planner and that sets out the grand plans for the economy. And I have studied ever since I did my PhD back in the 80s. I've studied economies, not every last one. I've certainly studied the big ones. I certainly studied Argentina as sort of the example of the opposite situation. And I don't believe, if one really does look at the economic record, that one can put forward an argument that top-down government decision-making produces a prosperity. Very quickly, I said before the Finance Committee last fall, I said, for 60-odd years, the Laurentian elites have believed that this, broadly speaking, tax, subsidize, and protect is the overarching vision to produce prosperity. And we now know it didn't.
No.
It produced the opposite of prosperity. It produced economic decline.
Yeah.
And so that's where I fault Mr. Carney in that budget. He's putting government at the center of decision making instead of saying, look, I'm going to remove the barriers to growth that Mr. Trudeau put there and barriers that were there before him. I'm going to open up the economy and that will catalyze the private sector. But he decided to instead keep the government at the center of the, shall we say, the decision making. And I just think that's a serious mistake.
Yeah, it seems that way. And if you've read his book, all signs were there that the central planning, the beatings would continue until morale improves. Expanding on that Argentina point, I think of Milei's success of late. I'm no economist. I have a poli-sci degree. And so I'm thankful to have your expertise. In what way is that proving to be a success? And how is that sort of differentiating itself from this centrally planned model where it doesn't seem like economies actually grow?
So let me just back up for a moment, because I've been using Argentina for literally 30-odd years in my classes and in media interviews. In 1918, and this is empirical information on the record, anybody can look it up. It's not secret. Argentina had a higher per capita income than Canada. Wow. And that's widely used by UN and StatsCan and OECD and IMF, average income per person. It's an overarching metric that, because the average income is, that's what we eat. That's what we consume. That's what we pay our groceries with. And what happened with Argentina was an incredibly wealthy, very resource-based economy. And then starting with Isabel and Juan Perón, they adopted policies that we should be quite familiar with, we're very experienced with, policies that said we're going to restrict foreign direct investment. We're going to create sectors of the economy that foreigners can't go there, where they put high confiscatory taxes, high capital gains taxes, huge government deficits, government intervention in sector after sector after sector. And it takes a long time to run down an economy. It doesn't happen overnight, but they managed to, in the next 20, 30 years, they drove it down. And just as my evidence for that statement, that they really did drive it down before Milei arrived, The average income per capita today, or 2 years ago, is $14,000 US per person.
Wow.
I mean, I just find that mind-boggling. The US, by the way, for a reference point, is 89,000. And so they went from one of the wealthiest countries in the world to dropping down to deep down in third world status. I know academics don't like to use the word third world. They think it's pejorative. Well, it probably is. That's because there's a lot of countries in the developing world that I have visited, unlike my critics, because I've taught over 80 times, actually over 100 times in developing countries around the world, including Cuba. I've been teaching in China since 1997. I've taught in just about every East European country immediately after the collapse of the Soviet Union, including Russia, including Ukraine. And I saw the up close and personal, the incredibly destructive impact on the society, on people, on the economy, on the environment of top-down central planning. I mean, it's got a track record that's just incredibly bad. And Argentina was the really good example. Milei is turning that around because what he's undoing are those pernicious, destructive policies that tied down the economy, that kept out foreign investment, drove foreign investment out. And so he's turning it around. I think it's going to take a lot longer than a couple of years, but at least he's taking it in the right direction. To great criticism, of course, by think tanks, some think tanks, and some academics.
Yeah, it's a great criticism, but great success.
Yes.
And I'm thankful that he's showing that he's lighting the way. He's the, courage is contagious. Hopefully, some of our governments, our first world governments, the pejorative, I suppose, take advantage of that. Now, you've previously described Canada's tariff relations as nonsensical. I'm of the same opinion here. I think even a poli-sci grad like myself and the non-economists in our audience, of which I'm right there with them, we can see that months of retaliations have only seemed to exacerbate matters.
Yes.
Do you still feel that way, and why?
I've felt that way since the very first trade agreement in 1988. I got my tenure track on July 1, 1988. I don't think I was on the job 4 weeks when I got phone calls from the media saying, people in media relations said, you're the guy to talk to about trade. And because the debate, John Turner and Mulroney. And I actually was debating some of the NDP and progressive people who are saying things that were just, I believe, hysterical, saying we were going to have to dismantle our public health care. If we signed a free trade agreement with the United States, we were going to be forced to sell our water to the United States. And I was on stage in high school saying, it's not in the agreement. It doesn't say that anywhere. You're making it up. And I've been supportive of free trade, and I've supported every free trade agreement that we have done in Canada from then until now. Why am I talking about free trade? Because it's the antithesis of tariffs. If you think of free trade at one end of the continuum, tariffs are at the opposite end of the continuum. In fact, free trade agreements, starting with the GATT in 1945, which morphed into the WTO, it's for many, many years, all it talked about was one thing. How can we get rid of or reduce tariffs? That's all. It was just an anti-tariff thing. Later, it developed into it picked up other issues. But so my point is, tariffs we've known for 200 years, since Adam Smith probably, that they're very destructive. They slow down growth. They harm economic growth. They create lower incomes. They hurt low-income people more than high-income people, as most government policies do. That because they fall the negative impact falls disproportionately on low-income people.
Yeah.
And so just get right to it. Tariffs is a tax. That's all it is. People get mystified by tariffs. All it is a tax. Every time you hear the word tariff, just say, no, they're not talking about tariffs. They're talking about taxes. They want to raise my taxes. Yeah. So when the government was saying we want to do retaliation, what they were saying was we want to tax and exploit Canadians to show Donald Trump how angry we are at the Americans.
Yeah.
Wait a minute. You're going to go after me and beat me up and millions of me so you can show your anger at Donald Trump. I'm not Donald Trump. Why are you whacking me? And that's what we were doing. Ford was doing it in Ontario, and we were doing it nationally. And it was truly, setting aside whether it works, and there's very good evidence it didn't work in terms of changing the Americans, but even setting that aside, it was a tax on Canadians that made us less affluent at a time when housing is, there's serious questions about affordability as well as groceries. So here were our national leaders saying, let's make life even more unaffordable in Canada. And I've never understood, and I know they were doing it for political reasons, but I don't understand why somebody didn't just stand up and say, look, I can't do this. I've got integrity. I'm not going to stand up and tell fairy tales to the people. And I'm just not going to con you and tell you that we're going to put tariffs on you to go and hit Donald Trump in the head. And I wish that Premier Ford had the courage to say it. I wish that Carney had said that at the time.
And this is the time where they're asking Canadians to make sacrifices, quote unquote. But we know who's making the sacrifices. It's your students. It's our young and working age who can't afford homes and who are struggling to buy groceries.
And let me throw, because you know me, I like metrics and I keep them high level, but I'll explain why. I just gave a presentation in Ottawa yesterday on why the tariffs don't work. And I was using the data from Trevor Tome and also just some data from the U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis. The U.S. has a lower percentage of trade than any other Western country, high-income country. 11% of their economy is traded. Now, it's because they're so huge. What that means in plain English is 89% of their economy is traded inside the United States. The phrase that economists like to use is they self-trade. They trade with themselves because the economy is so enormous. Okay, we are a third. Europe, there's some countries in Europe that are up to 50 and 60%. I'm not against trade. I believe in trade. What I'm trying to say is anything you do to the Americans is not going to have the same impact, A, because they're huge, and B, because they only trade 11%. And when you look at the trade by state, it's very small. I mean, all these Canadian politicians were running around saying the U.S. is going to come to its knees if we put these. This is just absurd. This is just silly. If you look at the size of the states, the percentage of our trade with any one state, it's less than 2 digits. Many of the states, it's 2%, 3%, 4%. And we're saying that 2 or 3 or 4% is going to bring that Kentucky to its knees. No, it's not. No, it's not. No, we're wrong factually. They're just plain wrong factually. It's as if somebody was saying the Blue Jays won the World Series. Well, no.
I wish they
did, but they lost. And we got to deal with factual reality. And these people are blowing smoke, and they're substituting ideology and emotion for hard empirical evidence. And so the impact of the tariffs on the states was very, very minor.
Yeah, and we're playing Indian poker with the 2 on our forehead and acting like we have this incredible leverage. And that might play well, and this sort of spite-based policy might play well with some in the liberal base, but it's falling on everyone else to pick up the pieces. The budget projects a $78.3 billion deficit for this fiscal year, marking the largest in Canadian history outside of the pandemic. How sustainable do you view this level of deficit spending in this current economic climate?
I'm glad you asked the question. I really do, because I think I don't want to sound like I'm patting myself on the back, but I think I have a more nuanced view. I am not one of those conservatives that say all government debt is bad, and it's just bad.
I don't just austerity.
I just don't believe that. I am not somebody who thinks that we should be borrowing for our groceries, and that what I mean by that phrase is consumption. Borrowing money to pay for a consumption program called pharmacare or daycare, I just think is terrible. I do agree with Carney on that point. If you're going to borrow, you want to borrow for long-term assets called infrastructure that has a big multiplier. It pays into the future, many years into the future. Consumption, for those who don't understand, and there are people, especially I think, some of my progressive friends who don't understand this, and that's why I'm saying this. Consumption doesn't have a big multiplier. You give people money, they go spend it, and that's it. It's gone. It doesn't keep on generating wealth down the road. You build a bridge, and it's generating economic value for the life of the bridge, which could be 40 or 50 or 60 years. And so economic infrastructure has Adam Smith taught us this 250 years ago, by the way. He actually wrote about this, and Nobel Prizes have been given in this ever since. What infrastructure does is it speeds up the movement of goods and services over distance. And that is economically valuable. And so true infrastructure, true investment, and I don't mean investing in a daycare center, and I'm not against daycare. I'm just saying that that's not infrastructure, and that doesn't have that multiplier. Investing in ports, roads, railroads, airports, anything where you're moving stuff is going to speed up the economy or reduce the cost of doing it is going to add value to the economy. And because we've neglected our infrastructure for many years, because of the past government, we have a deficit in infrastructure that we've got to make up, which will benefit the economy. So to your question, I don't believe that Canada is going to hit the wall, a debt wall, like we did in 1995. We're not there yet. But that's no justification for saying, oh, well, then let's just keep on going to debt.
Yeah.
I mean, because I've argued this over and over, and then Coyne wrote a very nice column about 3 weeks ago making a very, very similar argument. No one economic decision makes you hit the debt wall.
Yeah.
It's the accumulation of many, many, many decisions saying, oh, well, it's another $5 billion. So what's another 5 billion and 5 billion and 5 billion? Then one day you wake up and your debt is much, much larger. And now you are approaching the debt wall. That's one danger, is that we are incrementally, it's the boiling frog analogy. And that's one fear I have, that we're slowly doing what we did again in the run up to 1995. No one decision in any 1 year caused us to hit the debt wall in 1995. It was the accumulation of all the past decisions that started under Pierre Trudeau that caused us to hit the debt wall. Second point I want to make, and this is where I wish Mr. Carney, who I do respect, he's a well-educated man, obviously, but he is perpetuating the spin out of Ottawa that we have one of the lowest debt to GDP because they're using net debt.
Yeah.
And they're playing games, everybody, dishonest games. Why do I say that? Because if you look at the OECD, not my opinion, not Ian Lee's opinion, the OECD, the IMF, all of the international agencies, and they're not partisan. They're funded by us and the other high-income countries. They use gross debt, not net debt, for a very obvious reason. You owe the interest on the gross debt. And yet there's the people running around saying, oh, well, gross debt doesn't count because we've got all these assets in the pension fund and we've got all these government buildings. You're not going to repossess the pension fund and repossess government buildings if ever that you did run into a crisis. You use gross debt because you owe the money. Yeah. It's like saying, my house has a lot of equity, so I'm going to subtract it from my mortgage. So now go to the bank and say, I know my mortgage says I owe $1 million, but I really don't owe you $1 million. I only owe you $500,000 because I've got $500,000 of equity. So I'm going to subtract that from the money I owe you. That is just nonsense, people. That's dishonest. If you have a mortgage and you signed a debt for $1 million, you owe $1 million. And people, some economists who are real pure say you can't draw parallels between the individual and the state because the state can borrow through a central bank. That is true. But to say then, therefore, that all of the principles that somehow you don't owe money on debt, you don't owe interest on debt, is not true. But there are things that are still true for individuals and companies and governments. One of them is if you borrow money, you have to pay it back, and you have to pay it back with interest. And so our gross debt to GDP is actually in the middle of the OECD. We're right up there, we're below France, by the way.
I'm worried about the creative accounting there, but I appreciate your perspective on investment. This isn't all bad, even if I see some political terminology they're using. My concern is that I want meaningful investment. I don't want credit for projects already underway. I don't want small little tchotchke investments. I want pipelines. I want, anti-resource legislation to go away. I think the budget suggests that the emissions cap on oil and gas could be scrapped, but replaced with further industrial carbon tax increases, incentives for carbon capture. We're still not seeing the removal of these anti-resource bills or a tanker ban. How effective do you think this will be for economic competitiveness, for our energy sector?
I think it's crucial because, again, more empirical data. Stephen Gordon, who just retired from Laval, published these studies based on StatsCan data. StatsCan's been publishing this. Trevor Tome has. The industries with the highest productivity and the highest profit contribution to the Canadian economy is the resource sector and oil and gas.
Yeah.
If you listen to Premier Ford or anybody in Ottawa, you would absolutely be convinced that the cars are it. That's our future.
It's our EV subsidies that no one wants. Yeah.
And yet we have to pour billions and billions and billions into the auto industry to keep it alive. We don't have to pour billions into the oil and gas industry because, as the German chancellor told us, we don't want your cars. We want your oil and gas. And the Japanese prime minister said the same thing, and the South Korean prime minister. The world wants our resources, not our great, big, huge cars.
I thought there was no business case for those resources.
I
Isn't that what we said?
Yeah, and he was saying it at the very moment that Biden was approving LNG tankers to go to Europe because of the war, because of Putin. And it was just so embarrassing. It was so embarrassing. He said there's no business case for the exporting of LNG. And literally the ships were going out on television that day out of the States, which showed either he doesn't read anything or he was just ignoring what he had been told. I don't know. But your larger point on the investment, yes, I agree with Carney that investment is going to have a much better benefit for the economy. But then you get into the methodology, because if we broaden the definition to include things that are not investment, community arenas, daycare centers, this is not infrastructure. It isn't.
That's spending.
That's spending. That's consumption. And I'm not saying we should spend consumption. We have lots of course, there's a lot of consumption. Old age pensions is classified, when I say as consumption. You're not building something that's going to last for years and years into the future. So I know they broadened out the definition of investment in part to drive down the consumption number so they can say that they're solving the deficit, because they're defining it now as only consumption spending. I don't agree with that. I think all debt is part of the national debt. And we can still talk about the need to prioritize investment, and we should be. And so he's doing that. I mean, I support him on that, but I'm worried that they're going to broaden using this new definition. They're going to use it to slip a lot of consumption type spending into what they're calling investment when it isn't. And so that uses the support for what he's doing.
Yeah, I want to be wrong about my concerns here. I see some political exit ramps. I see rhetorical devices and even changes to immigration where on one hand, it's looking favorable for young people who are having their wages suppressed or they're unemployed in the market. But then you see like a call for this kind of potential blanket amnesty that could be abused, that is just going to keep the problem in the country for them of a temporary foreign worker seemingly grandfathered in. Have you had a chance to go through the immigration changes? What do you see for how that might impact our labor market dynamics, or even our chance to, let's say, to give our young people some growth from a GDP per capita perspective?
I only looked at the high level numbers because that's normally what I look at, is the high level rather than going deep down into the particular program.
Yep.
They are, and I will give them credit for this, Mr. Trudeau, and I'm just doing a compare and contrast when I keep going back to Trudeau. Trudeau had driven down, immigration has three components.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's got economic immigration, where you're bringing people in because they've got the skills we need and want in our country. And then you have family reunification. And these, I want to be careful, but they tend to be older people who are, mom and granddad. And I'll be very blunt and probably offend some people. They're not going to help our economy because most of them are retired.
Yeah.
Or they're very, very near retirement. And then the third category are refugees. And so Mr. Trudeau drove down, it used to be 75, 80%, if I recall, for many, many years, 75% was economic migrants, which we need, still do.
Yeah.
And then Mr. Trudeau drove that down very significantly. Well, in the budget, it says that percentage is going back up. Well, that's good. That is good. I didn't look far enough to find out if he reversed some other of the things that Mr. Trudeau had done. I can name one that drives me crazy, and I'm hoping you will pick it up in your program. And Harper passed late in his administration. He passed, I think it was late, I think it was at the tail end, at the back end, a law that an amendment that said if you are coming to Canada, you must be fluent in English or French. If you can believe it, before that was passed, a person could come here if they had the points and not speak a word of English or French, which meant you can't work because business operates in English. We all know that. So Trudeau passed that law. Harper passed it. And then Trudeau changed it, reversed it. So what were we doing? We were bringing in lots of people who couldn't speak a word of English or French. So what did we do? We put them on welfare. We don't call it that, but that's what it is because they can't work. It's not their fault. We brought them in. We said, come on into Canada. And by the way, you can't work. So then we had to end putting them into housing paid for by the government. We had to give them an income to be able to eat and survive. And so it was literally a government-made policy decision that undermined ourselves. That's called, shooting the puck into your own net. And I hope that they bring back that rule. It's not that I'm being ethnocentric. The
No.
reality of this country is if you're in Quebec, you have to speak French. I understand that. I live like 3 kilometers from the border with Quebec, and I have family on the Quebec side in Gatineau, and I've been over there many times. And you got to speak French if you're going to live in Quebec. And the rest of Canada, you have to speak English. That's what all the companies operate in, whether it's retail malls or whatever. And so, abolishing that rule that Trudeau did created dependency, created welfare, created ghettos. I mean, I thought it was almost just a weird form of harm to New Canadians. They were hurting. They weren't helping New Canadians. They were consigning them to a very low status.
A balkanized existence too.
A balkanized existence. And it was
yeah.
unnecessary when we could say, look, we'll bring anyone in. You have to have the skills and the points. And one of those things is you must be fluent in English or French, because if you don't, you can't function, and then you don't integrate. That's the other problem. If you don't speak English or French, how on earth can you integrate if you don't speak the language of the culture? Yeah. And so I think it created social problems that didn't need to be created.
Yeah, and there are obvious tweaks there, and that's one of them. Whether it's a return to a more diligent point system, obviously sustainable numbers, but there has to be cohesion, there has to be assimilation. It lost in the sort of, but the GDP goes up or throwing numbers at a problem coming out of COVID is the fact that you're just making conditions worse for all involved, whether it is the frustrations of Canadians seeing, issues piling up in the housing or healthcare or even public safety, the chaos with trucking on our roads, or the newcomers who live this balkanized existence, or maybe they're 15 to a basement and they're part now of this caste system, this replacement cog system. They don't speak the language well. They're not going to assimilate. It is a non-winning scenario for absolutely everybody.
And for many years we had an immigration system that was admired around the world.
Envy of the world.
And Canadians supported it. It was a bipartisan consensus because we didn't go overboard. We were bringing in 350,000 a year. And there was a consensus around that. And we did, I think, I didn't say perfect, but we did a way better job integrating immigrants than Europe. I've been to Europe many, many times. I've seen what they call les banlieues, where these are immigrant ghettos. Because France has done a terrible job. And Germany did a terrible job integrating their immigrants. Let's be blunt. Yeah. We didn't. We integrated people in Canada. And one of the, I think, reasons was because most of the immigrants did speak English or French. Yeah. And we made sure they did go into ghettos, into immigrant ghettos. And I think that Mr. Trudeau blew that up. I really do believe he blew it up. That's one of the great one of the great policies that damaged our country. And he undermined the strong support for immigration, which has been there for 80, 90 years. He successfully managed to, when the majority of people now think they're opposed to immigration.
I know.
You caused damage to us on the immigration.
You couldn't do
help to immigrants.
It's like if you were trying to create the conditions for unrest too and unhappiness, like you would have done it that exact way. I was speaking to a politician who will stay off the record last night from Surrey. And he told me that, he's a born and raised, the integrated Canadian, proudly so, the Sikh in heritage. And he says there are now neighborhoods in Surrey when he's doing his constituency work where entire buildings, like no English whatsoever. And so it's that balkanization concern is real, that lack of cohesiveness. We see it in our economy.
And this isn't, some people say that's anti-immigrant. No, it's not. It's pro-immigrant. Because you want them to integrate. And if they can't speak the language, they're not going to integrate. This is just so fundamental. And I thought it was such a destructive and pernicious policy of Mr. Trudeau when he said, no, you don't have to speak English or French to come to Canada. I thought it caused great damage to Canada.
It was so thoughtless, that tweet that, opened us up to the world. We stopped vetting even our foreign students. And so I am glad to know that there are, some signs of optimism coming out of the budget here. I greatly appreciate your perspective. I know our audience does as well. Professor, thanks for joining us.
My great pleasure. Thanks for inviting me. Thank you.